welcome everybody to Chris's much anticipated guest lecture. I can't wait. I know you can't either. Without further ado, let me pass over to Chris. Thank you so much for giving the lecture. I was thrilled when you said that you were able to.
No, I'm so fucking happy because this has been on my mind for like months, and then you just like gave me an avenue. So I'm Chris, your tutor, and today I'm taking over Rebecca's role, and I'm going to explore trans theology, which is this like mix of like anthropology, history, theology, and queer theory, trans studies. And I've titled my talk, Is a Trans Theology Possible? As a provocation, because for centuries, trans and non-binary subjects were objects of contemplation rather than subjects in their own right. They did not have a voice of their own because men spoke for them. If you read the intro to Kobe Gordon's Glorious Bodies, you'll know that even in the 21st century, highly regarded scholars in early modern studies were desperate to keep trans people out. They were content speaking for trans subjects and fetishizing them as objects of erotic gender review. But trans history has been booming lately. Dozens of books like those above have been published in the past decade. These are books aimed not at scholars, but at a general readership. And what these books share is a concerted effort to interrogate cisgender assumptions and their capacity to limit our understanding of history as non-binary, trans, and queer. So for example, in Before We Were Trans, Kit Hayam outlines the existence of a third gender in Edo, Japan. After women were banned from kabuki theatre, Wakashi took over the role. These were boys who had transitioned into a gender neither male nor female, which was desired by men and women alike. A culture of homophobia tightly regulated summarized sexuality. Those caught sleeping together were shamed. Yet those who didn't sleep with Wakashi were also shamed. Normative male sexuality was tied to relations with courtesans and Wakashi. This tells us that the Wakashi weren't gay men. They were a third gender, a site of non-binary, bisexual, and trans identity all at once. The popularity of Wakashi led to girls transitioning into this gender. However, these Wakashi wore men's jackets to distinguish themselves from women. So within the Wakashi, you had femboys who weren't boys and butch girls who weren't girls. So gender is messy, sexuality is messy, and cisgender categories fail to capture the complexity of gender relations across history. And this is where my subtitle comes from. The Non-Binary Lives of Jesus Christ, Eunuch, Mother, and Divine Hermaphrodite. I use these contradictory terms to signal the messiness of gender in a religion known for enforcing cisgender norms through modern colonialism. I picked Christ as my subject of study because he's a figure virtually known to everyone, yet so much more than his image suggests on crosses, murals, and memes. When you delve into his history, he becomes a fraught term. Much of this gender instability comes from Christ's own followers. Their need for clarity and grace in a world ruled by rich elites, crushing familial obligations, and the curse of a gendered embodiment that masks our angelic non-binary nature. Through the figures of the eunuch, the mother, and the hermaphrodite, gender is resisted and reformed through performative and metaphorical means. And we're going to begin immediately after Christ's death in the patristic period and focus on the early writers who composed the New Testament. We'll look at the historical Jesus' role in resisting Roman imperialism and how his parables, acts, and tribulations constructed an alternative masculinity to that of Roman paternalism. This will lead us to the second section that deals with the birth of Christian humanism in the High Middle Ages. Here we'll see how the institutionalization of the Eucharist led to the birth of pastoral care and a new vision of Jesus as a motherly figure whose teachings flow like milk from heaven and whose spear wound is the entry point into a bridal union with God. Finally, we'll finish in the Renaissance and see how the humanist theology of the High Middle Ages developed into a belief that the Philosopher's Stone was a Jesus-Mary hermaphrodite, whose powers of transmutation could return us to our perfect bodies of paradise. This will be the longest section. I'll be taking some detours through demonology and angelology to show the deep entanglement of divinity and non-binary bodies in Christian thought. I'll also explore how scholars from radically different backgrounds, Jewish, Gnostic, and Orthodox, continually return to the question of non-binary gender before the fall, and how these debates led to the belief that a divine hermaphrodite, composed of Jesus and Mary, was the catalyst of salvation. And what we'll see across these three sections are three different modes of gender fucking, from gender inversion, gender fluidity, to non-binary gender. So part 1, eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Our story begins in Palestine, the land where Jesus was born, an occupied land ruled over by the Roman Empire through murder, torture, and enslavement. No one had human rights. Anyone could be killed if they stood in the way of Roman imperialism, and the might of Rome was great. A culture of paternalism pervaded Roman society, the idea that every household was under the authority of the Roman emperor, who exercised dominance and protection in return for obedience, submission, and devotion. Status was tied to masculinity, and masculinity was proven through feats, influence over others, and mastery over oneself. The conquered were tied to femininity and ridiculed. We see this in Roman artifacts. The statue above depicts Emperor Claudius as Rome, raising his fist to strike Britannia, a cowering, denuded woman. Embossed on coins were personifications of Judea in mourning over her subjugation. My fellow queer historian Jamie Orchard has talked about how triumphs rode through the streets of Rome. These were military marches showcasing the spoils of war, from statues and paintings to captive soldiers and their families destined for slavery. These processions were seen as dignified, even sacred, committed in honor of Jupiter. Some believe the triumphs were an embodiment of Jupiter himself, a manifestation of divinity. In some, militarism, misogyny, and theft composed the divine ideology of Rome. For the biblical scholars James Crosley and Robert Miles, it was Roman imperialism that radicalized Jesus, a carpenter from Nazareth, Galilee. The people who lived in Nazareth sustained themselves by producing cereals, olives, and figs, as well as grazing cattle, goats, and sheep. Much of their wealth was expropriated by the ruling classes, as tithes to priests, rent to landlords, and taxes to the Roman state. Despite their capacity for subsistence, they lived a precarious life. They were at risk of famine and banditry. Their money went to gentrification projects, temples dedicated to foreign gods that bore the artistic style of their conquerors. Such projects would have displaced thousands of people in Galilee through the acquisition of land, the generation of debt, and the creation of a temporary labour force with no guarantee of employment after the project was finished. Alongside these acts of cultural imperialism was class war. When a Jewish uprising broke out in the nearby city of Sepphoris, or Zippori in Jewish, it was burned to the ground. Its people were called bandits and enslaved. One of the subsequent projects of occupied Galilee was building Sepphoris. Jews living in Galilee would have been deeply aware of how their money was going towards the suppression of their own people, disguised as acts of civic duty and cultural revitalization. This wasn't their land anymore, and they were living through a cultural genocide. So we have two intersecting forces of oppression here, patriarchy and exploitation. What's of interest to us is the way Jesus responds to these forces, for he does so in a way that subverts Roman masculinity and Jewish tradition at the levels of gender and class. Firstly, Jesus was a carpenter, not a learned man, yet he taught scripture in public. Opponents of Christianity mocked Jesus for his trade, for how could a carpenter say anything meaningful about scripture? The Jewish scribe Ben Sirah wrote, "The wisdom of the scribe depends on the opportunity of leisure. How can one become wise who handles the plough, who glories in the shaft of a goad, who drives oxen and is occupied with their work, and whose talk is about bulls. Arguments like this were cast at Jesus, who was seen as illiterate, lacking in the education required for governance and scholarly thought. He was most assuredly not a philosopher, denied authority in such lofty topics as politics, ethics, and theology. Yet, it's likely he understood Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew, for he drew on Aramaic sayings, Greek words, and Jewish scripture throughout the New Testament. His name alone can be traced back to Yeshua, a Hebrew name connected to Moses, the Jewish prophet who freed his people from Egyptian slavery. Jesus' parents may have named him this in response to the oppression they faced as Jews. It's just as likely Jesus chose this name himself, as a promise to other Jews of an imminent and final uprising against Rome. But what was the nature of this uprising? Crossley and Miles argue that Jesus constructed a counter-hegemonic form of masculinity through his embrace of an itinerant lifestyle, his rejection of Roman kinship, and his espousal of servitude in place of conquest. So we know the story of Jesus, right? He moved from village to village, helping the disabled, the sick, the starving. He hung out with fishermen, sex workers, and sugar mummies who financed his travels. And he preached without discrimination to women, who were traditionally excluded from theological debates due to their corrupting influences. Rather than lead a home as a patriarch, he chose homelessness. Rather than marry and procreate, he wandered Palestine with a surrogate family. And rather than seek power and glory, he preached compassion and humility, arguing that true greatness came from being the servant of all, that the last would be the first, and that the weak would inherit the earth. This was radical stuff, and Jesus and his disciples knew that. There are passages in the Bible where Jesus explicitly calls his male disciples eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Not only did Jesus accept women into his fold, he saw himself metaphorically as a self-castrated man, cut away from the profane values of Rome. Yet Crossley and Miles note that masculinity isn't rejected, but recast. They argue that Jesus re-signifies castration from emasculation into a more transcendent form of masculinity, a masculinity that emerges out of the will to self-sacrifice, to put a stranger ahead of oneself, in a total denunciation of Roman paternalism, militarism, and genocide. In other words, the eunuch signals towards a superior masculinity tied to Christian divinity. The ultimate arc of self-sacrifice is martyrdom, to endure the severest beatings before death, to die for one's beliefs, that in the face of corruption and oppression, you uphold your values to the last breath. It's an early articulation of revolutionary suicide. Huey P. Newton's idea that it is better to oppose the forces that would drive me to self-murder than to endure them. Although I risk death, there is the possibility, if not the probability, of changing intolerable conditions. For even if your uprising is crushed, you'll become a martyr and inspire countless others. Revolutionary suicide, like Jesus' eunuch, signifies defeat as heroic rather than humiliating, a sort of butch revisioning of femininity. Such a rhetoric wasn't opium for the people. It was not used to pacify followers, but to incite them. Jesus stormed the temple in Jerusalem during Passover, a Jewish festival that celebrated the liberation of the Hebrews from Egyptian rule. He overturned the tables of money changers and proclaimed, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers and bandits." He said to his disciples, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here. All will be thrown down." But Jesus did not live to see the fall of Rome. He was arrested and crucified between two bandits, which, if we recall from earlier, was a title given to insurrectionists. Jesus was tortured, stripped of his clothes, and jeered at by those he came to save. But true to his values, he asked God to forgive them, and he gave his life to fulfill that request. through the power of revolutionary martyrdom, this moment of brute violence and humiliation becomes a symbol of resistance, redemption, and divinity. A Christianity inseparable from the fires of revolt. So let's conclude this narrative with a particular focus on how gender is deployed as a mode of resistance. So Roman paternalism, it wasn't just a material oppression in the lives of Jews. It was a sacrilege. It posited the emperor of Rome as a god, pillage and murder as divine. Imperialism and gentrification led to the displacement of Jewish families and culture. Rather than fight for recognition as Roman citizens, Jesus and his disciples rejected Rome completely. Part of this resistance occurred through the subversion of masculinity, whereby vulnerability, compassion, humility, and sacrifice were valued above force and status. This was a radical act, but it didn't dismantle the gender hierarchy of Rome. It inverted it. Those who were the most self-sacrificing, the most dedicated to the cause, became the most masculine, closest to the divine. And we still see this logic in activist circles that shame their less capable or active members. Its presence can be felt in cycles of burnout, where your needs are pushed aside for the task at hand, and its roots in femininity remain in habits like people-pleasing, where the more one sacrifices oneself, the more one is praised as a woman. And this isn't to throw Jesus under the bus. It's profound what he achieved with the tools he had at hand. To invert Roman paternalism by revaluing the feminine is queer as fuck. However, patriarchy remained unchallenged before its systems of evaluating who is most deserving of power, prestige, and divinity. Only the content of these terms changed, because an inversion of values does not destroy the hierarchy that ranks such values in the first place. And this is the limit of any identity defined by an inversion of the other. You remain enslaved to the other, trapped in binary thought. This is a danger multiple feminist writers have outlined throughout this course, of valorizing femininity uncritically and losing all else that you could be. So now we're going to jump ahead 1,000 years into Europe in the High Middle Ages with part 2, like milk poured out from Christ's own breasts. Things are going to get a lot queerer here, and more fluid in every sense of that term. But we're also going to see the persistence of the gender binary and the patriarchal metaphors that scaffold it. So I want you to hold these contradictions together of binary and non-binary logics that both inform and limit one another. So by the 11th century, Christianity has spread across Europe. It was no longer a religion led by the oppressed, and those who rose up against orthodoxy were deemed heretical and crushed. This is the Christianity you're likely more familiar with, particularly its involvement in modern colonialism. This was the period of the Gregorian Reform, the Church's attempt to consolidate divine power in a world filled with too many wonders. In the period after Christ's death, miracles and holy artifacts were widespread. They could appear anywhere, at any time, as easily as God manifesting as a flaming bush. Such an ontology of the divine threatened established powers. Through the institutionalization of the Eucharist, miracles became governable. Consecration was reserved to learned men who knew the sacraments. Only the clergy could administer the Eucharist. Only the clergy could turn bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. Through the Eucharist, women, peasants, and heretical sects were denied divine power and religious authority. Even as divine power was consolidated, the meaning of the divine was contested. Prior to the Gregorian Reform, salvation was delivered through prayer. Monks would cloister themselves in monasteries, isolated from mundane life, and pray for humankind. Their prayers were vicarious, performed for a laity who did not know the proper rituals to communion with God. With the advent of the Eucharist, salvation shifted from prayer to pastoral care, the administration of the Eucharist to lay people. While the clergy retained control over the rites to communion, their closer contact with the laity and the Eucharist led to concerns over transubstantiation, the manifestation of Christ in the material world. The medieval historian Caroline Walker Bynum notes that the God of early medieval writing and art is a judge and a king, to whom propitiation is offered by hordes of monks. Christ is a prince, reigning from the throne of the cross, and Mary is his queen. The fundamental dramas of religion are cosmic, wars between Christ and the devil, saints, angels, and demons. In contrast, 11th and 12th century writers begin to stress Christ's humanity, building into the Christian life a literal imitation of his ministry. The fundamental religious drama is now located within the self, and it is less a battle than a journey toward God. In other words, divinity is increasingly humanized after the Gregorian reform. The Christ of heaven is less important than the Christ of earth, his human virtues, acts, and tribulations that lead to paradise. He's seen as a model for the self, and this 12th century self understood imitation as the highest form of pedagogy. To be Christian in the high Middle Ages was to be the change you wished to see in the world. Paradoxically, monks turned to Jesus' human life for divine inspiration, and the human in Christianity is associated with the feminine. Those of you familiar with Paradise Lost will know that the curse of humanity is attributed to Eve. In the poem, Satan is given 2 lines of punishment, while Eve is scolded for pages for being the victim of someone else's malice. To have a body, to suffer hunger, sickness, and death is the fault of Eve. Particularly misogynistic monks fixated on this, spilling pages of ink to detail their repulsion of menstruation and pregnancy. Yet Christ destabilizes the meaning of this founding myth, for it's only through God's incarnation into a body that salvation is delivered at all. Through Christ, the material body and the feminine are re-signified as sites of grace, despite, or perhaps because of, their association with sin. Some medieval writers even wondered if Jesus, the saviour of man, could or should have incarnated as a woman. So this leads to a strange phenomenon. The figure of Mother Jesus emerges in 11th century devotional writings across a range of Cistercian monks from England, France, and Belgium. William of Santerre wrote, "Those unsearchable riches of your glory, Lord, were hidden in your secret place in heaven until the soldier's spear opened the side of your Son, and from it flowed the mysteries of our redemption. Now, we may not only thrust our fingers into his side, but through that open door may enter whole, O Jesus, even into your heart. Open us to your body's side, that those who wish the secrets of your Son may enter in and receive the sacraments that flow therefrom, even the price of their redemption." Garrick of Eden wrote, "Behold, all at once, the Holy Spirit was sent from heaven, like milk poured out from Christ's own breasts, and Peter was filled with an abundance of milk. Not long after, Saul became Paul, the persecutor became the preacher, the torturer became the mother, the executioner became the nurse, so that you might truly understand that the whole of his blood was changed into the sweetness of milk, his cruelty into loving kindness." And Bernard of Clairvaux wrote, in relation to his own clerical duties, that the bride yearns for one thing and receives another. In spite of her longing for the repose of contemplation, she is burdened with the task of preaching. Despite her desire to bask in the bridegroom Christ's presence, she is entrusted with cares of begetting and rearing children. She is reminded that she is a mother and that her duty is to suckle her babes and to provide food for her children. Too often we must interrupt the sweet kisses to feed the needy with the milk of doctrine. So there's a lot to unpack here. And I'm going to be free and loose with my pronouns. not only did monks depict Jesus as a mother, they depicted themselves as mothers. They saw themselves as sources of love, guidance, and forgiveness, virtues that could turn violent men into loving mothers. Their souls, considered feminine at the time, were devoted to Christ in holy matrimony. To nestle against Christ's breast was to seek his kindness. To drink Christ's milk was to be nourished with her guidance. And to enter Christ's gash was to unite with them on the path to redemption. Not only are motherly traits valorized, but relations with other male subjects are mediated through highly eroticized language. To contemplate Christ was to kiss him. To seek salvation was to enter her. To guide a fellow monk into grace was to breastfeed them like a child. Such relations cannot simply be understood as homoerotic because of the fluidity with which gender changes. Jesus is alternatively a mother, a bridegroom, and a father. Monks shift from mother to child to husband or wife. Gender cannot easily be defined here, because what's important is not so much gender identity than the use of gendered metaphors to construct a new form of religious authority. Mothering, with all its gendered associations, gave monks the values they needed to engage with their new social reality after the Gregorian reform. Fathering, with all its gendered associations of divine retribution, punishment, and might, was deemed an inadequate model for pastoral care. So just as Jesus rose up against Roman paternalism, Cistercians rejected Christian paternalism in the age of the Eucharist. And I want us to imagine this shift. What it would have been like to be a peasant in the 11th century, whose entire life is tilling a field and living in a hovel, to enter a church built from carved stones, whose spires reach into the heavens, whose halls are filled with celestial music, and whose delivery of the Eucharist is a divine manifestation of Christ's body and blood. This is a transcendental event, but one based in embodiment, transubstantiation, the union of man and God into a paradoxical substance that unites with one's own body and soul. Through the Eucharist, one becomes Christ. He delivers his whole body, just as the mother delivers hers through milk. And though we're dealing with gendered metaphors, a lot of these ideas were quite literal. Medieval medical theory understood milk as processed blood, a literal sacrifice of one's body for the nourishment of another. Sacrifice links the historical Jesus to the Eucharist, transforms Jesus the martyr into Jesus the mother, and takes us from the hard masculinity of Jewish revolt to the soft femininity of Christian communion. I give my life for the cause. I transform my blood into milk. I sacrifice my body for yours. And I'm not going to interrogate the problematic valorization of motherhood here, because we're going to have a fantastic lecture next week by Charlotte Bruce Kells, who's going to do that in relation to Jacinda. Instead, I'm going to focus on gender fluidity, trans embodiment, and non-binary saints. So remember how I said that prior to the Gregorian reform, God as a divine king was valorized in spiritual writing and art. This association of divinity with masculinity led to depictions of the Virgin Mary with a beard, because Mary, containing the Son of God, must be divine and therefore masculine. Joan of Arc was beloved, not because she transgressed womanhood, but because she transcended it to approach divinity. Stories abound of women dressing as men to enter monasteries, and of having ecstatic visions where they appear as men before God, perfected of their bodily defects. And nuns gained religious authority as mystics by becoming virgins for life. These experiences were driven by misogyny, hatred of Eve and the feminine, yet they align with trans experience, of being born in the wrong body, and of being denied recognition for one's identity. The trans activist Leslie Feinberg explicitly links Joan of Arc to trans history, because while she was a religious martyr, she was legally executed for cross-dressing. Gender fluidity has paradoxically been encouraged and punished across the history of Christianity. So while gendered metaphors based in hierarchies can dehumanize the oppressed, so strongly that their only option is to conform to the oppressor's identity, such confirmations can destabilize gender and give birth to queer saints. This was not the intention of medieval nuns and monks, but it was the effect, and we live in the fallout of such strivings for divinity. So in sum, the Gregorian reform, a ploy to consolidate divine power under the church, led to the birth of feminism. Through the institutionalization of the Eucharist, miracles came under the control of the clergy, an elite class of learned men. They became administrators of salvation. This material shift in social relations led to an ontology of the divine that stressed the humanity of Christ, a humanity conceived as feminine. The same value of self-sacrifice that guided the historical Jesus developed in the mother Jesus, a devotional figure whose attributes were expressed through maternal metaphors. Yet even as Jesus was feminized, a strict binary wasn't enforced. He didn't simply transition into she. He was alternatively a bridegroom wedded to the feminine souls of monks, a mother suckling her dependents with scriptural milk, and a martyr penetrated in ecstatic reunion with God. The gendered metaphors of paternal and maternal love remained conservative and binary, yet their expression was gender fluid. God could just as easily be a woman, a man, or both. With Mother Jesus, masculinity as divinity is pushed to its limits, because if divinity is considered to contain all of humanity, then he must be she and all things in between. More than gender fluid, God must be non-binary. How are we going for time? Doing pretty good on time. Maybe I'll just keep going. Yeah, you can take a picture. Yeah, go for it. No, I was going to have a break and then go to the next part, but we're doing good on time, so I'll just keep going. Okay, so now we're up to part 3. Thus Jesus, Mary is and was one being. We're going to jump around a lot more in this section because I want to show the extent of non-binary thought in Christianity. As with the previous section, such articulations of gender are tied to divinity. However, neo-Christians direct these thinkers of what differentiates heavenly beings from earthly ones, and of how paradise will manifest at the end of time when all bodies are resurrected. We'll continue with the clergy of the post-Gregorian reform, who spilled a lot of ink about wet dreams and their demonic causes. We'll move on to fallen angels, who were understood by Cathars as sexless beings trapped in gendered bodies. I'll connect these celestial beings to early Jewish understandings of Adam and Eve, who were alternatively seen as a primal androgen, a being of 2 faces and 2 sexes, and a spiritual androgen, a being containing the potential of 2 sexes. Finally, we'll reach the Renaissance, where I'll detail the Jesus-Mary hermaphrodite of Alchemy, an idea that rebukes medieval ideas of monstrosity by reframing the hermaphrodite as a site of perfection. So don't worry too much about the details in this section. Just try and follow the general arc of non-binary thought as it shifts from angels to Adam to Jesus, and from a static form of perfection to a dynamic process of perfectibility. Okay, so remember how I said that the Eucharist led to closer contact between the clergy, the laity, and Christ? I didn't mention how this contact created intense anxiety about purity, of being corrupted by the material world, and of desecrating the Eucharist. The medieval historian Diane Elliott notes that one form of corruption was wet dreams, which were called nocturnal emissions by the clergy. These were moments where the body overwhelmed the will. Monks agonized over wet dreams because no amount of conscious discipline helped. The way they circumvented temptation made them appear malevolent, a violation of one's God-given capacity to make ethical choices. Augustine of Hippo, from the 4th century, was the first to connect such malevolence to demonic influence. He argued that a wet dream was an illusion created by the demonic manipulation of a monk's memories and thoughts. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, added that demons having no corporeal bodies of their own derived pleasure from intellectual power, the perverse joy of ruining a human life, in this case through sexual congress. Finally, Honorius Augusto Donensis connected the incorporeality of demons to their past lives as angels, which permits them to shapeshift between succubi and incubi with ease. By the 15th century, near the start of the witch hunts, demons were believed to pose as succubi to gather male seed, then shapeshift into incubi to deposit such seed into unsuspecting women, creating demonic offspring. The clergy were less interested in demonic offspring than their own corruption through sodomy, because although demons interfaced with them as succubi, their passivity in the sexual act transformed them into women. To be a man essentially raped by a demon was to become a woman corrupted by one's carnal body and one's inversion into another gender. The clergy were terrified of wet dreams, not just because they polluted the Eucharist, but because they threatened the heterosexual order of medieval Europe, a threat explicitly tied to gender fluidity and bisexuality, where the gender inversion of Jesus bespoke of divinity, the gender inversion of demons bespeaks of corruption. But there's something funny going on here with the fallen nature of demons. Because where exactly did their shape-shifting powers come from? From their origin as angels. Such a thought suggests that gender fluidity isn't demonic, but divine. The Cathars, a heretical Gnostic sect, had a different conception of fallen angels in the carnal body. They believed that human souls were fallen angels, and that sexual division was a consequence of the fall. Some believed the earth was hell, and that humans were demons who tormented one another out of ignorance of our divinity. For the Cathars, sex was a punishment, and the body a prison, for we were once angelic and non-binary. Yet the Cathars didn't hate the body. They saw it as a site of penitence, a vehicle towards salvation and reunification with God. The body was not a thing to be rejected. It was completely necessary, despite its final disposability. And these kinds of ideas populate other religions, such as Buddhism, which the Cathars grew on. Bodhisattvas and Buddhas are often depicted as androgynous. In the Mogwai caves, a holy site on the Silk Road, there are artworks of feminine bodhisattvas with facial hair and masculine Buddhas with breasts. Mother Jesus herself is mirrored in Chinese Buddhism through Guanxian, the goddess of compassion, who in India was once Avalokiteshvara, a male bodhisattva. Non-binary bodies are tied to divinity in Gnosticism and Buddhism, because both understand transcendence as an erasure of sexual difference. In paradise, there is no heterosexual order. And this fixation on the non-binary goes all the way back to the origin of humanity in Abrahamic faiths. Both Jewish and Christian scholars had heated debates about the sexes of Adam and Eve throughout the patristic period. This was because one origin story in the book of Genesis stated that God created Adam and Eve simultaneously, while another stated that God created Adam out of the earth and Eve out of his rib. The gender historian Leah Devon notes that these contradictory accounts of Genesis led to questions about whether man and woman were created on equal footing or if the superior sex appeared first. Some who subscribed to the second view, nonetheless, depicted Adam as an androgen rather than a man. This primal androgen was understood as sexually undifferentiated, a perfect union of male and female traits. Rabbinical commentaries from the 3rd century depict Adam with 2 faces and 2 sets of genitals, pregnant with an Eve yet to be separated from his body. Another theory, originating from Greece, understood Adam as a spiritual androgen, a sexless being who contained the potential of both sexes, yet to manifest into corporeal form. In both cases, androgyny is associated with purity, but a purity founded in sexual hybridity. Adam and Eve were intersex. It's only in the 5th century, when Christianity became the state religion of Rome, that such theories were suppressed. Roman theologians argued that the primal union of the sexes was a paired binary, a strict segregation of gender roles that naturalized Roman paternalism as a mirror image of divinity. Further violence followed when, in the 13th century, theologians connected androgyny to sodomy, transforming the divine androgen into a heresy. So what was once angelic and pure became demonic, deceptive, monstrous. Yet these ideas of androgyny persisted across the entire history of the Middle Ages. The Priscillians of 4th century Iberia used the divine androgen to promote gender egalitarian ideals, arguing that God was androgynous, as well as engaging with a wider intellectual circle composed of men and women. They were executed and their books burned by the church. Copies of their work survived and made their way to a monastic community of women in the 8th century France, who similarly saw God as androgynous. Further developments occurred after the republication of Ovid's Metamorphoses in the 11th century, which retold the myth of Hermaphroditus. In Ovid's rendition, Hermaphroditus, the son of Hermes and Aphrodite, is romantically pursued by Salmacis, a water nymph. When he rejects her advances, she prays for the gods to join them forever. They acquiesce, in their own cruel fashion, by fusing their bodies into one. Devon states that by the 13th century, the poem was central to the curricula of medieval schools, inspiring new attitudes towards change and the possibility of metamorphosis. Prior to this, Satan had been most commonly associated with metamorphosis, depicted through consumption, digestion, and defecation, signs of bodily corruption after the fall. Demons followed closely behind with their gender-bending mischief. And intersex bodies, while not capable of shape-shifting, carried, like demons, the threat of sodomy, the displacement of the heterosexual matrix, due to their presumed capacity to switch between male and female roles. Through Ovid, however, metamorphosis became associated with physical and spiritual transformation akin to the soul's journey to God. Alchemists, in particular, saw metamorphosis as capable of generating a state of perfection out of imbalance and disorder. They believed that equilibrium, the balance of constituent elements, would free them from cycles of earthly corruption and generation. The end goal was immortality, but such immortality was inextricable from divinity, a return to the body of Adam before the fall. They were seeking the final transition to end all transitions, a philosopher's stone capable of undoing the division that split us into sexed beings. Like the Cathars, they sought to become angels. The stone, like the Eucharist, was a miracle of unification with God. However, such unification was eschatological, concerned with the end of things. More than a ritual, it was a rite, the final passage to divinity. Alchemists connected the stone to the resurrection of the faithful at the end of time. Resurrection would remove all our imperfections and return us to paradise in wondrous bodies. There'd be no more death, there'd be no more birth nor death, no toil nor hunger, no disease nor war. And the one who would return us to this was Christ. Christ was understood as a mirror of Adam. Where Adam and Eve engendered the fall, Christ and Mary would engender the redemption. Christ's life was paradoxical. Their immaculate conception, their death and resurrection, these held purity and corruption in tension with one another. They were of the earth, yet divinely incarnated, a carpenter and a Messiah, of the lowest and highest birth. This was important because the stone was understood in similar terms, composed of reveries, a word translated from Arabic as to thing, and understood by 13th century alchemists as hermaphroditic. By the 14th century, Mary and Christ were understood as the rebus, the catalyst of transmutation. We see this convergence of mystical alchemy, the rebus, Christian eschatology, the resurrection, and Greek mythology, the hermaphrodite, in the picture above, where Mary, conflated with Aphrodite, carries Christ as Hermes in her body. Mary and Christ come to stand for hermaphroditus, with pregnancy as the site of paradoxical unity. And although traditional gender roles are on display here, strange inversions play out. For Hermes, Christ is associated with Mercury, an element typically seen as feminine. The implication is that Mary stands for divinity itself. The Aurora Consurgens, the text that this illustration comes from, provides further evidence for this. For it's written in the voice of Sapientia, the feminine personification of wisdom. Yet even here, gender isn't stable, for Sapientia has, across Christian theology, been associated with either or both Mary and Christ. If a gender binary exists in the Aurora Consurgens, it's neither segregated nor pure. Humanity and divinity are intermixed. The feminine and masculine fold into one another in a manner that Roman paternalism could never imagine, nor Christian conservatism ever allow. Absent from the Aurora Consurgens is a fear of demonic sodomy, because hybridity is a movement towards perfection. Hybridity sublimates its opposites into a greater whole, free from the imperfections of either part alone. And this greater whole, this alchemical hermaphrodite, has the power to deliver humankind to paradise. Okay, so we're at like nearly 3:50, so I reckon we have a break now and then come back at 4. All right, everyone, let's get back to it. So yeah, like we've gone through a lot of examples, and you can probably tell from how fucking in-depth I've gotten into all this that I love this shit. Like I love how queer and non-binary Christianity is when you dig the slightest bit beneath the surface. But something haunts all the examples I've gone through in part 3. Hatred of the body, even when it's seen as necessary, as a site of penitence or a composition in need of balancing. The body is incomplete. It's corrupted by sex. It needs to be transcended. But is bodily transcendence desirable, even if it's towards a non-binary form? We learn from Simone de Beauvoir that the body is vital to understanding one's place in the world, of connecting somatic experiences to the performative injunctions of becoming a gendered subject. The end goal of the Jesus-Mary hermaphrodite is not a gender spectrum, but gender sublimation, the effacement of sexual differences through the creation of an eternal virginal paradise. This is a conservative goal. Yet, the religious historian Barbara Newman notes that one of the primary reasons women became nuns was to escape marriage, to be protected from a life of abuse, rape, and servitude, as well as to be educated and produce beautiful works of theology and art. Virginity, a patriarchal ideal, was deployed by nuns to resist patriarchy. The 4th century monastic movement embraced asceticism. They believed they could reach angelic selfhood through a denial of their corrupted bodies. The body was the site of subjugation, pain, demand. Yet while we may disagree with this rejection of the body, they, like de Beauvoir, signal an oppressive body politic. Crossley and Miles argue that Christ's alternative masculinity refused Roman social relations, a refusal ending in revolutionary martyrdom. Bynum argued that Mother Jesus operated as a rejection of feudal relations, permitting abbots to be mothers, Christ to be one's bridegroom, and fellow monks to be one's children. This is a profoundly queer rendition of a found family, of creating solidarity out of material alienation. Gender is deployed to fight against injustice. Gender is an escape route. So I want us to hold these contradictions together, of radical disruptions emerging out of conservative grounds. Because we can't escape power relations, but we can always make trouble in them. Despite the oppressive scaffold of a gender binary that demands one's true sex be known so that sodomy can be avoided, gender fluidity persists across the Middle Ages. The Cathars believed we were non-binary angels fallen from grace through sexual differentiation. Jewish scholars argued that Adam, pregnant with Eve, contained both male and female traits. And alchemists conflated Hermaphroditus with Jesus Mary, transforming the philosopher's stone into a messianic substance whose redemption was inextricable from hybridity. These ideas were theological. What was at stake was divinity. Yet such ideas were resolved through non-binary bodies. Just as the divine androgen solved the paradox of Genesis, the Jesus-Mary hermaphrodite solved the riddle of rebus. By the time we reach 14th century alchemy, the non-binary has shifted from an essence of angelic being to a process of becoming angelic. Non-binary bodies are not only depicted as intersex and hybrid, but as redemptive. They bring equilibrium to an imbalanced world, and they create a third term, transcendent of the binary that founds it. They challenge the status quo through their association with Jesus, a theological figure of revolt. And they show us that we have always been here, folded into the most sacred texts of Christianity, never the same, always shifting, demonic or divine, and forever open to interrogation, resistance, and escape. So I know we just started, but I'm going to conclude now. So to conclude, a trans theology is already here. So history is messy, gender is messy, and cisgender frameworks make a mess of both. I hope I've made clear that trans history isn't about uncovering a person's true sex. That's the ideology of the fascist, the TERF, the transmedicalist. The cop who would rather imprison you in gender than give you the tools to set yourself free. But gender can be beautiful. It can speak of new social realities and inspire new ways of seeing the world. Nearly all of my primary sources were from men. The majority of my secondary sources were from women, trans, and non-binary scholars who had critically reappraised such works in light of feminism, queer theory, and trans studies. Through the work of scholars before me, Christian theology became a part of trans history because transness exceeds self-identity. Gender has always been fucked with, and when you understand gender as performative, all history becomes queer. So I hope I've shown not just examples of non-binary beings, but how to see the world through a non-binary lens. Because to me, thinking the world through transness opens new avenues of resistance. It shifts gender from an imperative to a line of flight. And it transforms even the most conservative of religions into sites of transgressive joy and hope. Anyway, that's my lecture. Thank you for coming.
Absolutely amazing. You've covered such a huge amount of ground in such an interesting way. So I feel like there will be queries, comments, and questions. Don't feel like pressured to form a question. You might just have a response for Chris. Who'd like to start on a bit of a discussion? We've got time. I can go first, maybe. And then, I'll go first, because one thing I was thinking of, I was reading this book recently by Barbara Thurn called Jesus the Man, right? Is pretty solidly placed there in the introduction. But what's interesting, so she's reading the Dead Sea Scrolls through the Pesha and seeing meanings that are embedded there. So the meaning of the text is embedded in the text, but you have to read it through the Pesha to get to the embedded meaning. And so she's kind of telling the story of Jesus from this perspective, and of course she's she lived, right, but when she released her book, you know, she was under extreme threat from that point on. So she said things and revealed things about Jesus that organised religion at that point weren't happy with, right? And I think it was the 80s, you know, it might have been the late 80s or early 90s that her book comes out. But one of the things that she reveals is that one thing that I thought was hysterically funny is that Satan was a really common name in the ancient world.
Holy shit.
So, you know, every second kid was called Satan. So that was kind of funny. But she talks about how Jesus was, you know, he argued quite strenuously for women to be admitted to the priesthood as it was practiced at that time, and he was hated for that. And so if we want to, even in a text like that, you know, Barbara Thuring's text, we see, you know, you just go a little way in and suddenly you come up and it's like Jesus is arguing for women to be priests, you know. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting was that he was constantly coming up against orthodoxy and challenging orthodoxy. So, you know, where we do that in our lives, we are very much in the vein of Jesus as opposed to those who represent the orthodoxy. And some of the ways that he would do this, when he would subvert things by showing up late, showing up early, like absurdly early, and he would also enter spaces the wrong way. So someone of his status must come through this door and only those people come through that door. So he would make a point of coming through that wrong door. And, you know, the Dead Sea Scrolls are sort of complaining about how he was constantly doing this. He was constantly upsetting orthodoxy. And it's amazing, isn't it, that he's been kind of converted into this instrument of orthodoxy. And amazing and really sad, actually. So the other thing I was that your material caused me to remember was about the succubus and incubus bits, right? And the way, I mean, there are competing explanations for the witch hunts. And, you know, feminist historians have really argued that misogyny was a key motivator there. And Walter Stephen, not exactly disagreeing with the feminist historians, pointed out that one of the things about this sort of interaction with a succubus or an incubus, if you are found to be a witch, it means they've found that you had sex with a demon. Right? Therefore, demons exist, therefore God exists. So witches were really important for proving the existence of God. And legitimating this religious structure that they were wanting to govern the body, you know, body politic through. So that's interesting, a kind of a different take there on the figure of the witch, not just hated for purposes of misogyny, but also called upon to prove God's existence.
I think there's something very interesting going on there because, like, the kind of the demon I was talking about that really comes into existence after the Cathars have been like really like, you guys are heretics, no angels, no angelic, you know, non-binary self. This never fucking happened. And then suddenly we have demons like becoming more and more of a threat. So it's proving a certain kind of God. They use like demons to enforce this is the image of God, not the one the Cathars were like promoting. Like, they use demons to demonize non-binary and gender fluid like depictions of divinity.
So to get people in line with a particular understanding of the God. And a straightened, as it were, understanding of the God.
Which is again like what happened to Jesus. Like, you read the shit he does. He's just disruptive. He's really disruptive. He's really like just. And back when like he was around, like, Jewish men wouldn't even talk to their wives in public. Like, that's how fucking segregated it was. And he straight up would just talk to like women and just like, you know, preach, and then they would even like start, you know, engaging with what he was saying. Like, there was literal exchange. And I know that doesn't sound like much, but it was crazy for that to be happening. So, like, that's the thing. Like, I guess what I was doing here was almost like trying to depict Jesus as this kind of ontological force of transgression, which conservatives have tried to mask as much as possible. Like I had a slide in a draft version of this that talked about the KKK in comparison to the Knights of Labour. So the KKK, like they were using Christ to argue, well, we hate Jews, we hate black people, we hate queers, we hate socialists. These are all like impure, corrupting forces on, this divine white America that we want to bring about. At the same time that was happening, you had the Knights of Labour, who were one of the first like labor unions in America. And at one point they had like 1 million members. They were fucking massive. And they were like, actually, for socialism to be brought about, we need to like cross racial, gender, like occupational lines and unite workers under this new like divine global order that actually takes care of its people. Like two completely competing depictions of divinity, both using Jesus and Christianity to push that. Yeah.
Further comments and responses?
What about kind of like in the modern day? How does sort of like, is there sort of like a queer representation of like Christianity in the modern day as well? That's not something I know much about.
This is something I don't know much about either, because for some reason I've become a big history buff this year. But I know there is a field or like movement called like queer theology. And I know that there is a movement of like queer evangelism in America, purposefully fighting against the super reactionary evangelicals. Yeah.
Because it's just like, I mean, the way that you portrayed it, it's just very much like, how do I say it? It becomes almost like natural, right? It's like it's just sort of part of the religion. So I'm thinking, I mean, that sounds like a pretty good way to kind of make religion more accepting, it feels like. It's almost like part of like life, in the sense that it can, like it probably wouldn't be, like you said, that it won't be too weird for like a lot of these sorts of like other gendered expressions, and of course, like I think a lot of it is couched in motivation, like people, like you kind of almost use these religious interpretations in order to, like you said, escape from certain like servitudes or certain bad positions, and using religion to like to be able to express who you are or what you want, basically.
Yeah, well, I guess like something, like so many of these examples, like, like I stressed how like these guys, like they weren't questioning their own gender, but they were very queer in how they expressed it regardless. Like, and I feel like so many of the gender historians that touch on this stuff are trying to bring to light that, no one had heard of Foucault in the 1100s, but that doesn't mean that like there aren't these big interrogations and just the idea of like it being natural, like if just seeing how over hundreds of years like non-binary thinking keeps resurging, no matter how much the conservatives try and stamp it out, it returns. Like it does feel like an almost like natural primal force at the same time that conservatism is doing a similar thing. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if that answers the question or is a response. Yeah, Corey?
I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I'm just sort of thinking about how the resurgence of whether someone needs to impose power, they seem to need to impose gender at the same time.
Yeah.
And how that seems to be like some inherent like dynamic that keeps coming up in the way that like non-binary thinking starts, and then it's like, no, shut up, sit down. This is how it is.
Yeah.
Just noticing, I guess. I don't have a question.
I feel like so much of like reactionary populist discourse is an erasing of history. Like, you know, why do they bring up terms like traditional gender roles? Like it's a pretty short tradition that they've got there. Like, you know, what do I have to say about reactions? Something that like inspired me to write this was a lot of TERFs being like, oh, trans is a recent invention, blah, blah, blah. And they're just riffing off like the medicalization of trans people. And like I've been reading a lot of other history, like the history of the medical invention of the hermaphroditism in the 1800s. And it was like all these medical men trying the hardest they could to find the true sex of everyone. But the more they looked at people's like gonads and et cetera, the more confused they got. They would have these big conferences where all the like masterminds would come together, like 30 of them would all be like looking at a person's gonads, and they couldn't agree what it was. And this just kept happening, and they kept moving to like different parts of the body to be like, maybe this part would tell us. And then they would find like men with more perfect breasts than women. They were just like, what the fuck is going on? And, like, so you have a whole like section of history of men failing to confirm the gender binary. I feel like this is why reactionaries want to face history and science, because if you look at any of it, it destroys their claims. Like that's why they're pushing such like closed-minded logics. Yeah.
I feel like when Satan and demons became seen as like fluid in gender and sex, that's still acknowledging that fluidity in gender and sex existed, even if it was demonized. So like when so many people now, especially conservative Christians, deny things like gender fluidity and queerness existing until recently, like not even just demonizing but wanting to exclude that kind of question from Christianity altogether, like it just doesn't even exist.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. Like, I guess some of these phenomena have existed for a while. Like, before Europe started, like, studying intersex people were already doing that in, like, Arabia. And they were categorizing, like, people into multiple sexes without judgment. And it's a few years later that it becomes connected with sodomy. So you had a quite open, there was a period of time where, you know, there was quite open acceptance of like non-binary sexes. And again, with the demons, like that's such it's so overtly tied to like witchcraft and its eventual destruction, the destruction of women. Where am I going with this? I guess it's a very different tactic, right? Like, I feel like non-binary and trans people are still very visible in these discourses, despite their identities being denied. There are still like TERFs being like, that's just a man in a dress, that's a man in a dress, that's a man in a dress, and they're obsessed with that. They make so much discourse around that. So there's still lots of visibility. Like the literal demonization of like trans people. Like I feel like the imagery of the demon is still here, even if they're not seen as ontologically non-binary anymore. Don't know if that answers the question.
Now, do we have further comments, queries, responses? Or are we all going to step back out into the rain? All right. Well, in that case, Chris, I just want to say a final thank you so much, not just for your presentation today, but all the many hours of work that undergirds an excellent presentation like this. It's not easily done. It might feel easy for you, but I see that there's a lot of amazing scholarship underpinning this that you've done.
Yeah,
so congratulations. And thank you so much. And I'm going to give you a very big round of applause with everyone.